Hello, and welcome to Sleep History. Tonight, I'm going to take you somewhere quiet, somewhere slow. We are stepping into the long, dark winter nights of the Middle Ages. Outside, the daylight fades early. The days grow shorter, almost without you noticing. And the warmth inside your home is never quite enough. In a medieval world, winter is not simply a cold season. It is a time that reshapes the way people sleep, the way they rest, and the way they move through each day. There are no great battles in this story, no dramatic turning points. What happens here is much quieter than that. The night slows down. People make small decisions. They repeat small rituals. They learn small habits. And those habits carry them through until morning. In this journey, we will try to understand how a person living in the Middle Ages experienced a winter night. We will explore when they went to sleep, why not everyone slept at the same hour, and why the night was never felt as one single, unbroken stretch of time. Along the way, we will gently compare their world to our own. In that era, sleep was not about comfort. It was about order. People did not sleep to feel better. They slept to reach the next morning. That small difference made some of their habits seem strange to us today. And yet, in their own time, those habits made perfect sense. Before we begin, a quiet request. If you enjoy this kind of content, consider subscribing to the channel. A like or a comment means a great deal. And if you feel like it, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I am genuinely curious who is out there and when. Now, turn off the lights. Find your most comfortable position. When you are ready, let us begin. When winter arrived in the Middle Ages, sleep was no longer an ordinary thing you did at the end of the day. Winter did not just change the weather. It changed how time itself was used. Daylight ended early. Evenings stretched long. But those long evening hours were not free time in any modern sense. They were hours that left very little room for mistakes. Sleep, then, could not be left to chance. In the winter months, sleep was less about resting the body and more about protecting it. People did not wish to sleep longer. They wished to sleep at the right time, because sleeping at the wrong hour could disrupt the work of the following day. In winter, there was no recovering lost time. A task delayed in the cold could become a burden too heavy to carry. So sleep was not experienced as a natural fading out at the end of the day. It was a conscious transition, a deliberate crossing from one state into another. When daylight disappeared, people did not rush to bed, but they did not stay up late either. The time in between was a slow and unhurried preparation. The body was gently settled. Quick movements were avoided. Sudden decisions were not made. The rhythm of the day was gradually brought down like a fire burning low. In the Middle Ages, sleep did not follow fixed hours the way it does today. There were no clocks, no alarms. Time was measured by light, by how far a candle had burned, by how long the fire had lasted. This did not make sleep flexible in a careless way. Quite the opposite. Each household built its own quiet order, shaped by the conditions of that place and that season. In summer, that order was looser. In winter, it became stricter. Winter sleep was taken more seriously because the risks were greater. Cold weakened the body's defenses. A night without rest left a person more vulnerable to illness. So people were careful not to let the whole night pass without sleep. And yet, deep and unbroken sleep was not something they expected either. Winter sleep was usually divided. This was not only a result of the cold or the discomfort, it was simply the habit. Many people woke briefly in the middle of the night, and this did not cause alarm. It was considered entirely normal. Because winter nights were long, sleep came in two parts. The first sleep began in the early evening. After some hours, a person would wake. During that waking time, they would sit quietly, perhaps watch the fire, perhaps pray, and then, after a while, they would drift into the second sleep. This pattern was especially common in the winter months. In medieval texts, you find the phrases first sleep and second sleep used quite naturally, as if everyone understood what they meant. The night was not one single thing. It was a sequence. And winter made that sequence even clearer because the darkness was longer and the silence was deeper. In those quiet hours between one sleep and the next, the mind did not want to be still. It rose to the surface gently and then slowly settled back down again. The seriousness of winter sleep was also connected to the order of the home itself. Heating was limited. The fire did not burn through the whole night, so sleep was often timed around the fire. It was better to fall asleep before the flames died down. Relighting a fire in the middle of the night was difficult, and it carried its own risks. So the fire shaped the timing of sleep in ways both practical and instinctive. Sleep, in those nights, was also bound to silence. Here is the continuation of the rewritten narration. Sleep, in those winter nights, was connected to silence in a very direct way. Outside, the sounds of the world faded. Beyond the wind, there was very little to hear. And that silence was not something separate from sleep. It was part of it. Noise was not expected. A sudden sound in the dark could unsettle the whole house. So movement inside the home was kept to a minimum after nightfall. No one spoke loudly. No one woke a sleeping person without good reason. Silence was not empty. It was protective. Another thing that made winter sleep feel serious was the uncertainty of the morning ahead. No one knew exactly when the sun would rise. No one knew how harsh the cold would be. That uncertainty made the night feel more delicate. People wanted to wake prepared. Rising tired was a poor way to begin a winter day. When all of this is considered together, a picture begins to form. In a medieval winter, sleep was not simply a habit. It was a kind of order. It was not random. It was not forced. But it was also not careless. People did not fight sleep. They managed it. And that made winter nights calmer, more controlled, and in a quiet way, more predictable than you might expect. When the sun set in a medieval winter, the day did not end, but it lost its pace. This loss was never sudden. No one stopped all at once. Life simply became heavier, almost without anyone noticing. The work of the day was completed, but the evening did not bring a new kind of energy. Instead, whatever pace remained was gently lowered. That lowering was the true beginning of sleep's preparation. Winter evenings were not stretched out the way summer evenings were. Light was valuable. Candles were limited. The fire was carefully managed. So when the sun disappeared, it did not only change the sky. It changed the behavior inside the home. People began to speak less. Movement slowed. Unnecessary tasks were set aside. This was a deliberate stillness, not an accidental one. The evening hours were not filled with the same kinds of work as the day. Heavy labor was not repeated after dark. Instead, simpler things were chosen. Things that required less effort and less thought. Small repairs were finished. Minor preparations were made. What was needed for the following day was quietly reviewed. These tasks filled the time, and at the same time, they slowed the mind. There is something worth pausing on here. The people of the Middle Ages did not use their evenings for entertainment. But this does not mean those evenings were gloomy. Quite the opposite. The evening offered a quieter kind of togetherness. Being in the same room was enough. Conversation was not required. Silence was not uncomfortable. In a winter evening, silence was simply the natural condition of things. There was also a physical reason for this slowing down. Winter days were harder on the body. Cold exhausts a person more quickly than warmth does. So by evening, people did not wish to remain on their feet for long. But neither did they rush immediately to bed. A transition was left between the two. That in-between time helped sleep arrive in a more settled way. The evening meal sat at the center of this gradual winding down. In winter, the meal was usually eaten earlier than in other seasons. After eating, people did not scatter immediately, but they did not linger for long either. There was a brief time of sitting together after the meal, a time for the tiredness of the day to settle and fade. This was less like conversation in the modern sense, and more like simply being still together. The tasks of the evening tended to repeat from one night to the next. The same movements in roughly the same order. That repetition quieted the mind. It made sleep easier to reach. You can see here a simpler version of what we might today call a nighttime routine. But in the medieval world, this routine was not personal. It was shared. Everyone in the household moved with the same gradual slowing. Everyone adjusted to it together. After sunset, the outside world became less present. Doors were closed. Visits grew rare. In winter, it was not common for guests to arrive in the evening. The roads were difficult. The cold had deepened. The home became more enclosed, more self-contained. The house became the center of the night. And within that enclosed space, the preparation for sleep quietly took shape. This gradual slowing had a direct effect on the quality of sleep itself. By the time a person lay down, the mind had already been moving slowly for some time. There were no sudden transitions, no sharp shifts from one state to another. And so sleep, when it came easily. In winter nights, falling asleep was rarely the difficulty. Staying asleep was the harder thing. The slowing that began at sunset was one of the foundations of medieval winter sleep. Sleep did not begin with a decision. It was the natural end of a long, gradual descent. The more balanced that descent, the more peaceful the night. People learned this through experience, not through instruction, not through books. And so they did not resist the slowing. They moved with it. In a medieval winter, the final tasks before bed were quieter and more careful than anything else in the day. They were not large tasks. They were not impressive ones. They were not grand. They were not ceremonial. But they were never neglected, because the night did not forgive mistakes, especially in winter. The small preparations made before sleep had a direct effect on the safety of the following morning. These final tasks were usually done in the same order. Every household had its own rhythm, but the logic was shared. First, the fire was checked. The flame was not allowed to die out completely, but it was not left burning too high either. The goal was not to heat the room through the night. The goal was simply to prevent the space from going completely cold. No one lingered long at the fire. One last look was enough. Then the doors and windows were checked. Locks, bolts, and coverings were secured. In winter, safety was not only about threats from outside. Cold air finding its way in could cause its own problems. So every gap that could be closed was closed. This was done without rushing, but without delay. Some of the final tasks were also about the day ahead. The work of the morning was briefly reviewed in the mind, but this planning was kept short. Thinking in too much detail kept the mind active, and an active mind delayed sleep. So what needed to be done was loosely noted, and then the thought was consciously let go. In winter nights, dwelling too long on tomorrow was not considered wise. In the Middle Ages, people avoided heavy conversation before bed. It had been noticed through experience that talking kept sleep away. This was not a scientific understanding. It was something learned by living. In the winter months especially, silence was preferred in the final hours of the evening. The last part of the night passed with fewer and fewer words. Another important part of the bedtime preparation was readying the body. This did not mean bathing. Washing frequently in winter was not common. Instead, the hands and face were cleaned. It was practical, and it was habitual. Becoming fully wet in cold air was seen as a risk. So cleanliness was limited, but it was regular. There was also a small ritual around clothing. The garments needed for the next morning were not left scattered carelessly. Because the morning would be cold, you would not want to stop and think about what to wear. So clothes were kept close to the bed or placed somewhere easy to reach. This made the morning a little less difficult to face. Some of the pre-sleep tasks were made up of repeated movements, the same actions in the same order. These movements slowed the mind. It was a simpler version of what we might today call habit. People did not do this consciously at first, but over time, they noticed that the pattern helped. Something worth noting in all of this is the sense of time. Without clocks, the duration of these final tasks was not precise, but people felt how long things were taking. The burning of a candle, the fading of a fire, these were the signals that shaped the timing of sleep. The purpose of these last tasks before bed was to bring the night under a kind of quiet control. When everything was in its place, the mind could settle. And when the mind settled, sleep came more easily. Falling asleep in a winter night was not usually the problem. The harder thing was sleeping peacefully. So the preparations were taken seriously. There is one more detail worth mentioning here. In the Middle Ages, these bedtime preparations were not a private, individual matter. They were a shared household routine. Everyone adjusted to the same pace. If one person fell out of step, the whole rhythm was disrupted, and that was not welcome. Winter called for collective movement, not individual preference. When the final tasks were done, the atmosphere changed noticeably. The light dimmed, sounds faded, movement slowed to almost nothing. This did not mean sleep arrived immediately, but it meant that sleep had become inevitable. People could feel that. The threshold had been crossed. These small but consistent tasks before bed were one of the foundations of sleep in a medieval winter. There were no grand rituals, but there was a repeated, reassuring order. And that order made the night more peaceful. People did not learn this from instruction. They learned it by living it. In medieval winter nights, the hours spent near the fire were among the most recognizable moments just before sleep. These hours belonged to a space between two states. The active part of the day was behind you. Sleep had not yet arrived, but the distance between the two was narrowing. People did not think of this time as something special, and yet they understood, without needing to say it, exactly what it was for. The fireside was a space set aside for the body to slow down. In winter, the fire is the center of the home. It does not only give warmth, it organizes time. How long the fire will burn, when it will begin to fade, and when it will be left to burn on its own. All of this shapes the course of the night. So the time spent by the fire was never stretched out carelessly, but it was never rushed through either. That balance had been learned through experience. During these quiet hours by the fire, very little was said. Whatever needed to be spoken during the day had already been spoken. The evening was not a time for opening new discussions, because conversation kept the mind alert, and an alert mind delayed sleep. Medieval people did not understand this in any scientific way, but they had learned it through the consequences of experience. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was not dull in any modern sense, because silence was simply a natural part of the night. People did not try to escape it. They recognized it as a sign that sleep was drawing near. The small sounds of the fire were enough. Nothing else was needed. The hands were mostly still during these fireside hours. Sometimes a simple repair was made. Sometimes an object was looked over. But these were not tasks that required focus. They did not tire the mind. And yet complete idleness was also avoided, because a fully empty mind could set thoughts moving again. And that was the enemy of sleep. In a medieval winter night, the hours by the fire held a careful middle ground. Not too occupied, not too empty. People did not pass this time. They completed it. There was no clock, but the sense that time had been properly filled was felt all the same. These fireside hours were also a time when the relationships inside the home became quieter. No one spoke above a low voice. No one hurried anyone else. Everyone adjusted to the same slow pace. That shared tempo helped sleep arrive in a more regular way. In winter nights, moving at your own individual speed was not welcomed. These quiet hours by the fire also prepared the ground for the divided nature of sleep itself. People were not fully relaxed here, but they were not on edge either. That in-between state was a forerunner of the brief wakings that would come later in the night. The mind was already accustomed to these transitions. In winter nights, that was considered entirely normal. The light of the fire was also part of this process. It was not bright. It was not sharp. It did not strain the eyes. That soft dimness felt like a natural invitation towards sleep. People did not stare into it for long, but they were not in complete darkness either. That middle level of light eased the passage into night. Something else happened by the fire, quietly. The thoughts of the day were allowed to slow. What had happened during the day was not reviewed at length. There might be a brief recollection, and then it was consciously let go. That act of releasing was a precondition for sleep. In winter nights, keeping the mind occupied was considered more exhausting than the cold itself. Some people prayed during these hours, but the prayer was not spoken aloud, and it was not long. Short, simple words were preferred. The aim was to settle the mind. Faith here was not a ceremony. It was a quiet regulator, and it helped sleep arrive more smoothly. The time spent by the fire was one of the quietest and most defining moments of a medieval winter night. The things done here were not large, but the things deliberately not done were what mattered most. No rushing, no noise, no straining of the mind. And because of that, sleep came naturally. When these quiet hours ended, Everyone felt that sleep had become inevitable. No one lay there wondering whether it was time. The place simply changed, from a fireside to the bed. That movement was the calmest of the day, and it almost always happened without difficulty. When people laid down to sleep in a medieval winter, what they rested on was not always a bed in any modern sense. But it was not disordered or random, either. Everyone had a sleeping space they knew, a space shaped by habit and by the conditions around them. The purpose of that space was not comfort. The purpose was to keep the cold from reaching the body directly. The idea of a bed carried a social meaning in the Middle Ages. In wealthier homes, raised bed frames could be found, but even these were not soft by any modern standard. More common were arrangements close to the floor. Wooden frames, sacks filled with straw, or layers of thick cloth were used. None of these kept a person warm on their own, but layered together, they served their purpose. In winter, the sleeping surface was never just one layer. The bottom layer was especially important, because cold rose from the ground. Lying directly on the floor was avoided. Straw, dried grass, or thick fabric was used beneath the body. This both cut the moisture rising from the earth and kept the cold from rising upward. The coverings placed on top existed to hold warmth in. Straw mattresses in the Middle Ages were not simply a sign of poverty. Straw traps air, and that makes it an effective insulator. It was particularly favored in winter for exactly that reason. It needed to be changed regularly, of course, but the same arrangement was kept throughout the cold season. Function came before cleanliness. The location of the sleeping area was not chosen carelessly, either. In winter, people slept in the part of the home least exposed to the wind. Spots near the door were avoided. Even choosing to rest against a wall was a considered decision. An outer wall facing the cold would be colder to the touch. Walls on the interior side of the house were considered safer. Sleeping areas were rarely for one person alone. More than one person might share the same arrangement. This was not only a matter of limited resources. Sharing body warmth was a meaningful advantage in winter. It was not seen as unusual. The understanding of private space was simply different then. The struggle against the cold came before individual preference. The bedding itself was not soft or light in any modern sense. Heavy fabrics were used. Wool was common. It was not always clean or well kept, but was still preferred, because wool holds warmth even when damp. In winter, that was a significant advantage. Appearance was secondary. The sleeping arrangement rarely changed for long stretches of time, because any change disrupted the habit. For a medieval person, habit was the key to falling asleep. The position of the bed, the feel of it, even its smell was familiar, and that familiarity made sleep easier to reach. Pillows were not common. Where they existed, they were not soft. They were small supports filled with fabric. The aim was not comfort. It was simply to keep the head from resting too close to the cold ground. Neck comfort was a secondary concern. The bed in a medieval winter was less a place of rest than a place of shelter. When people lay down, they did not fully release. Especially in the first part of the night, a kind of half-wakefulness was maintained. The body remained sensitive to its surroundings. This prepared the sleeper for the brief wakings that might come later in the night. By today's understanding, this might seem uncomfortable, but for a medieval person, it was familiar, and what was familiar tended to feel safe. In winter nights, safety mattered more than ease, so the sleeping space was shaped not by expectations, but by conditions. These arrangements formed the essential physical foundation of winter sleep. The fire might have faded, the room might have grown cold, but a properly prepared sleeping space was enough to carry a person through the night. People knew this, and they prepared accordingly. In a medieval winter, sleeping in the same room as others was entirely ordinary. It was not seen as a temporary solution or a habit born of necessity. It was simply the natural order of the household. People did not question it, because in winter, the priority was not personal space. It was shared warmth. Most homes had only one room, and even in homes with several rooms, people did not always sleep separately. Heating options were limited. The fire was usually lit in one place only. The rest of the house grew cold quickly. Sleeping together in a single room was the most practical way to preserve warmth. This was not only true in poorer homes. Even in more comfortable households, people might choose to sleep in the same space during winter nights. Heating a large room was difficult and costly. Gathering in a smaller area made the fire's warmth go further. The night passed with less chill. There was another reason for sleeping together, and that was safety. Winter nights were long and quiet. Sound from outside carried more clearly in the cold. People felt safer in company. This was not only a physical reassurance, it also brought a quieter state of mind. Sleeping alone in winter was considered more unsettling. The sense of privacy was different from what we know today. Sharing a room for sleep was not considered uncomfortable. It had continuity. People were used to it, and habit removes the feeling of discomfort. For a medieval person, what mattered was that the night passed without difficulty. Who slept where was a secondary concern. Children in the Middle Ages generally slept in the same room as adults. The idea of a separate children's space was not common. This was not only about the size of the home. It was also that children were wanted within sight through the night. In winter, the risk of illness was higher. Sleeping together also served as a form of quiet watching over one another. This shared sleeping arrangement was also well suited to the divided nature of sleep itself. In the night, one person might wake while another continued sleeping. This was considered normal. No one found it troubling, because everyone was part of the same arrangement. In winter nights, complete silence was never expected. Sharing a room also regulated the rhythm of the household. Everyone moved towards sleep at roughly the same hour. Everyone adjusted to the same gradual slowing. This helped sleep arrive in a more consistent way. Individual sleep schedules were not well received in winter, because one person's rhythm could affect the whole night for everyone else. This shared pattern also shaped the beginning of the morning. When one person woke, the others would stir slowly as well. Sudden rising was not welcomed. Moving quickly in a cold space carried its own risks. Being in the same room made the transition into morning gentler for everyone. The habit of sleeping together shows that in a medieval winter, sleep was a collective experience. It was not a private retreat. It was a shared state of rest. People accepted this as natural because the conditions required it. Winter left little room for individual preference. As a result of this arrangement, people did not expect to remain completely undisturbed through the night. Wakings were normal. Sounds were ordinary. Movement was tolerated. This made sleep more flexible, not more fragile. Winter nights were governed not by strict rules, but by shared habits. In a medieval winter, going to bed fully undressed was not common practice. The reason was not modesty, and it was not unfamiliarity. It was entirely practical. Winter nights were cold. Heat sources were limited. The fire had gone low or out completely. The room cooled quickly. Sleeping in your clothing was a sensible and safe choice. The garments worn during sleep were not entirely different from daytime clothing, but they tended to be looser and more layered. A lighter piece worn beneath something heavier was preferred. The aim was not ease of movement. The aim was to hold warmth close to the body. Comfort mattered more than appearance. No one thought about looking presentable while sleeping. Another reason that undressing was seen as a risk in winter nights was the possibility of sudden waking. Brief periods of wakefulness through the night were normal. In those moments, it might be necessary to get up, to check the fire, to investigate a sound, or simply to shift position. Having clothing already on meant the body was not immediately exposed to the cold. This allowed sleep to be interrupted without the body losing its warmth. In the Middle Ages, there was no separate category called night clothing. The idea of what we now think of as pajamas did not yet exist. People slept in simpler versions of what they wore during the day. This also made the transition into sleep easier. Changing clothes was an action that could reawaken a mind. In winter, that was not wanted. Another reason for sleeping dressed was the limitation of the bedding itself. The coverings were thick, but they were not always sufficient. As the night progressed, the room grew colder still. At that point, the clothing served as an additional layer of insulation. People were aware of this, and they prepared for it. This habit was even more common among children and older people. Both groups were more vulnerable to the cold. Keeping children warm through the night was important. Older people needed to be more careful about sudden loss of warmth, so they tended to wear more layers. This was not seen as excessive. It was seen as careful. Sleeping dressed also affected the depth of sleep itself. People did not rest in a state of complete release, especially in the first part of the night. The body remained sensitive to the world around it. In winter nights, this was a deliberate condition. Full relaxation was considered a risk. The clothing supported that state of light, watchful rest. This habit also made the first moments of morning easier to manage. On waking, there was no immediate contact with the cold. People would first sit up, then rise slowly. Having clothing already on made that transition less jarring. In winter mornings, sudden movements were avoided. Sleeping in clothing shows how functional the medieval understanding of sleep truly was. The goal was not to be comfortable. The goal was to pass the night without difficulty. People accepted this as natural because there was no alternative. Winter did not ask for preference. It asked for adaptation. To a modern eye, this habit might seem strange, but in its own context, it was entirely consistent. People took precautions not simply to avoid feeling cold, but to avoid becoming ill. Sleep was an important part of those precautions. Clothing was not the enemy of sleep. It was one of its quiet supports. In a medieval winter, sharing a sleeping space with animals under the same roof was not an exception. In many places, it was a deliberate choice. That choice did not come from emotional attachment to animals. It came from a very practical need. In winter nights, the most valuable thing was warmth, and animals were one of the natural sources of it. In rural areas, homes were often designed with both people and animals in mind. The lower level or a section of the building was set aside for the animals. People slept above or in an adjacent space. But this division was not always clearly defined. On the harshest winter nights, the presence of animals noticeably raised the overall warmth of the home. This was something everyone understood. The heat that animals produced could not be controlled the way a fire could. But it was constant. It was there through the whole night. The fire might die down. The candle would burn out. But the animals remained. Being near them meant passing the night with a little less cold. People had learned this through experience. There was no calculation behind it. But the result was plain to see. To a modern eye, this might seem uncomfortable. But for a medieval person, it was simply familiar. The smells, the sounds, the occasional movement, none of these were considered disturbances because they were continuous. And what is continuous eventually fade from notice. In winter nights, what mattered was not silence. It was continuity. The presence of animals provided exactly that. Sleeping under the same roof as animals did not always mean sleeping side by side with them. Often there was a wall, a door, or a thick partition between, but the shared warmth still passed through. This arrangement was considered more suitable both for safety and for health. This was especially true of larger animals. Cattle, oxen, and horses generated considerably more heat than smaller animals. So the spaces they occupied were placed in the more sheltered parts of the home. This also benefited the animals themselves. They were protected from the cold. It was a balance that served both sides. Another effect of living under the same roof as animals was its connection to the night wakings. Animals could move and make sounds through the night. This did not greatly disturb the people nearby, because people were not expecting unbroken sleep to begin with. Brief wakings were normal. Animal sounds were simply part of the night. For children, this environment also had a quiet formative quality. They grew up accustomed to animal sounds in the dark. The fear of night was not as intense as it might be today, because the darkness was never completely silent. There was always some movement, some sound. That made the night feel more familiar. The presence of animals also shaped the order of the household. Standards of cleanliness were different from today's, but this did not mean disorder. Everything had its place. The area where the animals lived was not entirely separate from human life, but it had its own boundaries. Those boundaries were maintained through habit. Sleeping under the same roof as animals in a medieval winter was part of the relationship that people of that era had with the natural world. A person did not separate themselves from nature. They learned to live alongside it, and sleep was part of that shared life. Animals were not a disruption to sleep. They were one of its quiet supports. This habit did not make sleep deeper or more comfortable, but it made it more sustainable. In winter nights, the goal was not perfect sleep. The goal was to reach morning. Sleeping under the same roof as animals served that goal. In a medieval winter, sleep was not experienced as one continuous and unbroken whole. Waking during the night was ordinary. It was even expected. People did not see it as a problem, because the night was not a single stretch of time. It was a process divided into parts. This understanding became especially clear in the winter months. In the first part of the night, sleep would come. It was usually not deep sleep. The body began to rest, but the connection to the surroundings was never fully cut. Waking after some time was normal. No one would have called it insomnia. It was simply the natural movement of the night. These moments of waking did not cause alarm. People did not leap out of bed. There was no quick movement. First, one would sit up. The surroundings would be listened to. It would become clear that everything was still safe. Sometimes a glance toward the fire. Sometimes simply waiting in silence. That waiting did not tire the mind, because there was no expectation attached to it. Remaining awake was not something that needed to be done. It was simply something that happened. In the Middle Ages, these waking intervals were not used for thinking. People did not reach for anything to occupy the mind. Long plans were not made. The day was not reviewed or assessed, because it had been noticed through experience that doing so would drive sleep away entirely. So wakefulness was lived as a passive state. Some people prayed during these intervals, but the prayer was never long. Short, repeated phrases were preferred. The aim was to keep the mind still. Faith here was not an obligation. It was a quiet regulator. It helped ease the passage into the second part of sleep. In winter nights, these kinds of gentle repetitions created a sense of safety. The environmental conditions also played a part in these wakings. The cold did not allow the body to fully release. Sleeping dressed supported a state of light wakefulness. Animal sounds, the wind, the fading of the fire, these things could bring a person briefly to the surface. But they were not disturbances. They were expected. People slept with them in mind. These waking intervals prepared the way for the second part of the night. After a time, sleep would return, and this second sleep tended to be deeper, because the body had already received its first rest. The mind had settled further. This pattern was especially common in winter nights. The long darkness supported the division. Each part of sleep served a different purpose. The first slowed the body. The second restored it. That balance was well suited to the conditions of winter. The night wakings also fitted naturally with the shared sleeping arrangement. One person stirring did not immediately disturb the others, because everyone was accustomed to it. Quiet movements and low sounds were ordinary. No one expected complete silence. This made sleep more flexible, not more fragile. There is one more detail worth noting here. In medieval written sources, brief activities in the middle of the night are mentioned quite naturally. Sitting up, praying, checking the fire. This shows that waking intervals were socially accepted. The night was not seen as a time when one was required to be asleep at every moment. In winter nights, divided sleep was not a weakness. It was a form of adaptation. People had learned to sleep according to the conditions around them. There was no expectation of unbroken rest, and that made the night less stressful. No one forced themselves to sleep. Sleep came and passed and came again. In medieval winter nights, silence and darkness were not things to be avoided. They were accepted and they were managed. People did not try to push the darkness back. They did not try to suppress the silence. Because in winter nights, these two things were the natural companions of sleep. Rather than struggle against them, people simply adjusted. Darkness was not an abnormal condition for a medieval person. When the sun went down, the world genuinely became dark. Candles existed, but they were not lit at every moment. Light was a limited resource, so darkness was the default state of the night. People were not completely blind in the dark. The eyes adjusted, and that made the night feel less threatening. Silence was understood in a similar way. The sounds of the day faded with the evening. Noise from outside would fall away, but this was not complete silence. Wind, animals, the small sounds of the house, these continued. They were not unsettling. They were familiar, and what is familiar tends to calm. There is an important distinction here. For a medieval person, silence did not mean emptiness. Silence was a sign that the surrounding order was intact. If the night became too noisy, something was likely wrong. Silence, on the other hand, meant that everything was as it should be. That understanding helped sleep arrive more easily. The relationship with darkness was not built on fear. There were certainly moments when the night inspired caution, but darkness alone was not considered a threat, because every night was the same. Something that repeats without change gradually becomes ordinary. People grew accustomed to that darkness from childhood, and so the fears of night remained limited. A continuously burning light through the night was not common in the Middle Ages. People had learned to sleep in darkness. Once the eyes were closed, whether the room was light or dark made very little difference. This habit helped sleep come more quickly. Light was not a precondition for rest. The relationship with silence followed a similar pattern. People were not unsettled by silence, because the mind did not immediately fill in a quiet space. The day had already brought enough tiredness. In winter, the body exhausted itself more quickly, and when that tiredness met silence, sleep was invited in. Silence did not provoke thought. It stopped it. Darkness and silence also fitted naturally with the divided structure of sleep itself. When a person woke in the night, the surroundings had not changed. No light was brought in. No sound was made. This helped the waking remain brief. The mind continued to receive the signal that the night was still ongoing, and that made returning to sleep easier. This understanding also shaped behavior within the home. Speaking loudly after dark was not welcome. Sudden movements were kept to a minimum. Doors were opened slowly. This was less about courtesy and more about habit, because everyone understood that the night was a delicate time. In winter, that delicacy was even more pronounced. This quiet accord with silence and darkness was one of the foundations of medieval winter sleep. People did not try to change these conditions. They accepted them, and that acceptance allowed sleep to arrive with less effort. Sleep was not seen as a destination to be reached the way it so often is in the modern world. Sleep was simply already there, waiting. This was also a relief to the mind. Not trying to control the night reduced the strain. In winter, that mattered greatly. The cold was already demanding enough. Adding a mental struggle on top of it was not something people wanted. And so silence and darkness were not treated as obstacles. They were treated as companions. In a medieval winter, sleep was important not only for rest, but for staying well. People could not explain illness the way we do today, but they had learned through experience which behaviors tended to lead to sickness. Those who stayed awake too long in the cold, who sweated in the night, or who moved too quickly between warmth and cold, were the ones who fell ill. And so sleep in winter was managed with greater care. The fear of illness in winter nights was quiet, but constant. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone acted according to it. Sleep was not delayed too long into the night. People tried not to become cold during the hours of darkness, and sweating was something to be deliberately avoided. Sweat in winter was considered dangerous. Coming into contact with cold air after sweating was seen as an open invitation to illness. For this reason, the arrangement of the bed, the choice of clothing, and the number of coverings were all adjusted with this concern in mind. People did not want to be so heavily covered that they sweated through the night, but they also did not want to be exposed and cold. That balance was something learned over time. In winter nights, finding the right measure was considered a mark of good sleep practice. In the Middle Ages, cold air alone was not seen as the primary cause of illness. The real danger was cold combined with dampness. For this reason, keeping the bedding dry was taken seriously. Damp straw or wet fabric was changed promptly. Moisture was considered the hidden enemy of sleep. The fear of illness also limited movement during the night. If it became necessary to get up, the movement was slow and careful. Doors were not opened abruptly. Cold air was not allowed to rush directly into the room. People paid attention to these small details because illness in winter did not affect only one person. It could move through the entire household. This concern was even more visible in the sleep arrangements made for children and older people. These groups were put to bed earlier. They were covered more thoroughly. They were checked on more often through the night. This was not excessive anxiety. It was ordinary precaution. In winter, those who were more vulnerable were watched over more carefully. Sleep duration was also shaped by this concern. Sleeping too little left the body weakened, but remaining completely still for too long was not considered good either. The divided sleep of the night played a balancing role here. The body neither grew fully cold nor fully released. This was thought to reduce the risk of illness. This understanding also influenced the morning. People did not rise abruptly from bed. First, they would sit up and allow the body to warm slightly before standing. This transition was especially important on winter mornings. Sudden movement was associated with vulnerability to illness. The fear of illness was not an anxiety that weighed on sleep. It was something that organized it. People did not panic because of it. Instead, they built a more careful kind of order around it. And that order helped the night pass more peacefully. In winter nights, stillness was itself a part of health. This view raised the value of sleep considerably. Sleep was not simply a way to recover from tiredness. It was seen as a protective shield that made it something to be taken seriously. In winter, staying up late without reason was considered an unnecessary risk. In a medieval winter, the sleep pattern was not the same for everyone. Children and older people occupied the more carefully planned side of the night. The reason for this was not sentiment. It was experience. People knew who was affected most quickly by winter, and that knowledge did not come from books. It came from years of quiet observation. Cold reached some bodies more quickly than others. Children were generally put to sleep earlier in the evening. This was not because they needed more sleep than adults. It was because they tired more quickly. Winter days were hard on children too. Space to play was limited. Moving around outdoors was difficult. So by evening, they settled into stillness sooner. And that stillness made the passage into sleep easier. Children's sleeping spaces were usually close to the adults. A separate room was rare. This created a sense of safety. Through the night, the sounds of a child's movement could be heard. This was not considered a disturbance. It was considered reassuring. On a winter night, the quiet breathing of a child nearby was a sign that the household was alive and well. Children were also dressed more warmly for sleep. This was not seen as excessive, because there was always a chance a child might push the coverings aside during the night. The clothing acted as a safeguard against that risk. It also meant that if they woke and stirred, they would not be immediately exposed to the cold. These small precautions had become habit over time. For older people, the situation was slightly different. They did not generally go to bed earlier, but their transition into sleep was slower. They might sit by the fire a little longer. This was less about needing warmth and more about rhythm. A body that had lived the same pattern for many years did not welcome abrupt changes. In winter nights, that slowness was an advantage. Older people tended to sleep more lightly. They might wake more often through the night. This was not alarming. It was considered ordinary. An older person lying awake in the night was seen as a kind of quiet presence watching over the house. Not a deliberate duty, but a reassuring one. What children and older people had in common was that sudden waking was to be avoided for both. For these groups, it was important that the environment remained consistent through the night. No light was suddenly brought in. No doors were shut sharply. This care was understood and observed by everyone in the household. The pattern carried into the morning as well. Children were not rushed awake. Their waking was not hurried. Older people tended to rise earlier, and that early waking allowed the house to come to life gradually. Winter mornings did not welcome sudden beginnings. The sleep patterns of children and older people show how flexibly sleep was lived in a medieval winter. Not everyone went to bed at the same hour. Not everyone slept in the same way, but everyone belonged to the same shared order. This was not individual adaptation. It was a collective one. This approach softened the overall rhythm of the household. No one felt as though they were racing against sleep. Winter nights called not for speed, but for balance. Children and older people were the natural markers of that balance. In a medieval winter, waking did not mean the night was over. It simply meant a change of direction, because winter mornings felt like a natural continuation of the night. The air was still cold. The light was still weak. The silence largely held. Waking, then, was not a sudden transition. It was a slow and gradual parting from sleep. In winter, the sun rose late. Daylight did not arrive as something that compelled a person to rise. When people opened their eyes, they found themselves still in something close to darkness. This slowed not only the body, but the mind as well. Waking was not a decision. It was an awareness that spread slowly through the senses. For this reason, people did not rise immediately from bed. First, they would sit up, then they would wait a while. They allowed the body temperature, which had dropped through the night, to begin recovering. Rushing was associated with illness. Sudden movement on a winter morning was not considered wise. So the wakings were slow, but they were deliberate. One reason a morning felt difficult to separate from sleep was the divided nature of the night itself. People had already slept and woken more than once by the time morning arrived. This did not diminish the quality of sleep, but it made the moment of final waking less clearly defined. The body did not immediately deliver the feeling of being fully awake, and so the morning stretched a little longer. In a medieval winter, the tasks of the early morning were limited. No one moved into heavy work in the first moments of the day. This was not laziness. It was the condition of things. Beginning hard labor with a cold body was seen as a risk. So the morning was a time of slow transition. The fire played an important role in the morning waking, but it was not lit immediately. First, the surroundings were assessed. The outside air was observed. The wind, the dampness, and whether snow had fallen were all noted. These small observations gave a sense of how the day ahead might unfold. Waking was not only rising from bed, it was re-establishing contact with the world. In a medieval winter, rising early was not considered the virtuous act it is sometimes seen as today, because in many cases, rising early simply meant more time spent in the cold. So people preferred to rise at the right moment, and that moment was determined by the light and the air outside, not by any inner sense of discipline. Conversation in the early morning was also limited. No one began the day with long exchanges. Voices were kept low, because the body had not yet fully warmed. This quietness preserved the gentle passage between night and morning. In winter, the calmer the transition was, the more steadily the day began. The difficulty of waking was not a matter of lacking purpose. People knew their work. They knew what needed to be done. But winter did not welcome rushing. The body wanted to prepare itself slowly against the cold. And so the morning was the heaviest part of the day and also among the most important. This slow waking also deepened the value of sleep itself. Even though the night had been divided, people would arrive at morning feeling rested, because through the night, the body had never fully disconnected. It had remained in quiet adjustment with its surroundings, and that continuous adjustment made the morning less jarring. The difficulty of waking on a winter morning was a natural consequence of how the medieval winter was structured. The nights were long. The days were short. That balance shaped human behavior. Waking was not a task. It was a process. And the more peacefully that process was lived, the more sustainable the day became. In a medieval winter, sleep did not belong only to the night. Its influence carried forward into the hours that followed. When people woke in the morning, they did not simply feel rested or tired. The mind carried something of the night with it. Because the winter nights were long, that trace was deeper than usual. Sleep did not only stop thought, it shaped it. The repeated pattern of winter sleep, night after night, gradually altered a person's sense of time. The boundary between night and day felt softer, because darkness covered most of the hours. This drew the mind away from urgency. People did not experience time as a series of minutes. They experienced it as a sequence of transitions. And sleep was at the center of those transitions. For this reason, people living through a medieval winter tended to appear more patient. But this patience was not a deliberate virtue. It was the result of habit, waiting through the night, waking, sleeping again, and moving slowly into morning. All of this cleared the mind of hurry. And a mind freed from hurry scattered less easily. That was one of the lasting effects of winter sleep. The mental state that remained after a winter night carried a steady kind of awareness. People did not live in a state of full detachment. The half-waking hours of the night left their mark on the day. People observed their surroundings more carefully. They noticed the condition of the weather, the strength of the fire, the signals the body was sending. This attentiveness was part of survival. This mental state might not seem comfortable by modern standards, but it was stable. People knew what to expect. They could roughly anticipate how the night would pass and how the morning would begin. That predictability was one of winter's most important reassurances, and sleep was at the heart of it. There is something important to note here. The medieval person did not look to sleep as an escape. Sleep was not seen as an interval in which the troubles of the day could be forgotten. It was more like a state of balance, something that kept the body and mind aligned along the same quiet line. That is why winter sleep is not dramatic. It is silent, but it is effective. As the weeks of winter passed, people who lived within this pattern found themselves offering less and less resistance. There was no struggle with sleep. The way it would come was known. The way it would divide was known too. That acceptance reduced the weight the mind carried. No one lay awake asking why sleep would not come, because waking was simply part of the system. This also shaped the emotional life of the season. Winter nights did not produce sharp rises and falls. Neither great surges of feeling nor sudden collapses were common, because the environment did not allow for them. The silence, the dimness, and the repetition held the emotions in a gentle steadiness. Sleep sustained that steadiness through the night. This mental state became noticeable when spring arrived. As the days began to lengthen, people woke earlier. They remained on their feet longer. But the slowness that winter had left behind continued for a while. This shows that sleep was not only something that belonged to the night. Sleep was the impression that the season left on the mind. Medieval winter sleep is different from what we know today, but is not lesser. In many ways, it is more consistent, because it is in harmony with its conditions. People did not try to make sleep ideal. They adjusted sleep to fit the season, and that meant less disappointment and less struggle. That is why sleep in the medieval winter nights is like a quiet teacher. It teaches unhurriedness. It teaches waiting. It teaches a person to receive waking as something natural. And above all, here is the continuation. And above all, it teaches that rest is not something you force. It arrives on its own terms. In the deepest weeks of winter, when the frost settled thick against the window's edge and the fire had burned down to a slow, steady glow, you would find yourself in a particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of something complete. The medieval world did not rush toward morning. It allowed morning to come, and there's a quiet wisdom in that. When you live through long nights, night after night, you begin to understand something about time that daylight rarely teaches. You understand that not every hour needs to be filled. That silence is not absence. That darkness is not something to be corrected. It simply is. The people of the medieval winter knew this without being told. They had not read about rest. They had not studied the value of stillness. They simply lived inside it, season after season, and their bodies learned. And what the body learns over many winters, it does not easily forget. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern that repeated with quiet reliability. The early dark, the gathering around warmth, the gradual loosening of the day's weight, and then gently sleep, not a sudden falling, a slow settling, like snow that does not storm but drifts. You would close your eyes not because the day had been defeated, but because the night had arrived and the night deserved its own kind of attention. That was the unspoken agreement between the medieval person and the season. The day asked for effort. The night asked for surrender. And the one who understood both lived more easily than the one who resisted either. This surrender was not weakness. It was knowledge. The kind of knowledge that does not come from thinking, but from yielding, from allowing the cold and the quiet and the darkness to do what they were always going to do anyway, and finding in that allowance something unexpectedly peaceful. By the time deep winter had passed its midpoint, this peace had become a kind of companion. It was there in the hour before sleep. It was there in the quiet interval of the night. And it was there again in the slow, unhurried movement toward morning. You did not fight the season. You moved with it. And in moving with it, you discovered that the body holds a deeper intelligence than the mind alone can access. An intelligence that knows when to wake and when to rest, when to speak and when to remain quiet, when to reach toward warmth and when to simply wait. Winter was the season that taught this most clearly, because winter gave you no choice but to slow down. And in slowing down, something opened, a quieter awareness, a softer relationship with time, a sense that the world was not moving against you, but simply moving, and that you were part of that movement. Sleep was the door through which that understanding passed each night. And each morning, when you rose slowly from the warmth of your blankets and felt the cold air settle against your face, you carried something of that understanding with you into the new day. Not as a thought, not as a memory, but as a feeling, a calm, unhurried readiness. The kind that only comes when you have rested not just the body, but the part of you that is always reaching, always asking, always waiting for something to change. In the medieval winter, that part of you finally rested too, and that perhaps is the deepest gift the long nights offered. Not just sleep, but peace. And that was more than enough, because in the end, that is what the medieval winter asked of you. Not greatness, not endurance in the heroic sense, not the kind of strength that announces itself, but the quieter kind, the kind that simply continues. That wakes when waking is needed. That rests when rest is offered. That meets the cold without collapsing and meets the warmth without clinging. Winter was a patient teacher, and sleep was its most repeated lesson. Night after night, the lesson was the same. Let go. Grow still. Trust the dark. Allow the body to do what the body knows. And when the night divides itself, as it always does, do not resist the waking. Sit with it. Let pass through you, and then return gently to the place where rest is waiting. That place was always there. It never moved. And perhaps that is the most quietly remarkable thing about the medieval winter night. In a world with so much uncertainty, so much that could not be controlled or predicted or held onto, sleep remained constant. It came when the fire burned low. It came when the wind pressed against the walls. It came when the body was heavy and the mind had finally grown tired of its own turning. It came without being asked, and it stayed for as long as it was needed. There is something in that constancy worth remembering, something that the long centuries have not erased, because it does not belong to any particular era. It belongs to the body, to the night, to the ancient agreement between living things and darkness that has existed far longer than any civilization. You are part of that agreement too. Every night, without ceremony, you enter the same quiet that those people entered long ago. The same stillness, the same gradual loosening of the day, the same slow passage towards something that cannot quite be named but can always be felt. Rest, not as an achievement, not as a reward, but as a return, a coming back to something that was always yours, something the body has always known how to do, even when the mind has forgotten. The medieval winter understood this deeply, and in its long, dark, unhurried nights, it preserved that understanding like an ember kept carefully through the cold. Small, quiet, but alive, waiting for morning, as it always was, as it always will be. Sleep well.